So yes, I'm Gav Thorpe. I'm here to chat about third edition Warhammer 40,000, which was a very important project. Unsurprisingly, we were just saying, probably over 25 years ago now, which is half my lifetime ago. I think a pivotal moment in the history of 40k in many ways. For a lot of players, third edition was their jumping on point when this edition came out in the next few years, and it obviously informed the next 2 or 3 editions of 40k and the presentation of it and the rules themselves, and to this day. And it came about for a very particular reason, really. It was all part of the plan, and from what I remember. But generally, the main driver on the rules side was to move the 40k system over to a proper battle game. Second edition 40k. So first edition 40k was very much a skirmish role-playing type of game. Second edition 40k was much more of a battle game. But even then, players were wanting to use bigger armies, and the sales team wanted to sell more miniatures as well. So that combined nicely. But the basic core games design that Rick came up with was to enable people to use more miniatures, really, and more units in a reasonable time frame. And so it was, other than essentially using elements of the same profile, the games design was rebuilt from the ground up by Rick, and then later developed by Andy Chambers, myself, and Jervis Johnson. Yes, so rather than maybe armies of 30 or 40 models, you could play with 60 or 70 models, depending on the faction. So, but it was also, I think people remember this version of 40k as a step up in the imagery. I think second edition 40k had a lot of classic 40k imagery in it, but the design of it in some ways was quite clean. The codexes and the rule books weren't very graphically heavy. They were very light, quite modern at the time, and again through various other games in the meantime, like Necromunda and Gorkamorka and things, the graphics and the, sort of like the density of textures and things is something that sort of like returned to 40k at this point, more inspired by Rogue Trader and the vibe that Rogue Trader gave us. But yeah, so the game itself was definitely streamlined, and one of the main points was trying to make units more of the basic element of the game rather than individual models, and so a lot of the streamlining that happened was with that in mind, so that Rick got rid of the movement characteristic, and there was sort of like standardized 6 inches movements. Again, there was a lot more rationalization of weapon ranges and weapon types and things like that. So second edition had been around for many years and had proliferated across lots of different codexes. So one of the other key points about third edition 40k was that the codexes were coming off the shelves and they would be rewritten, and we actually had a blank slate for redesigning the armies. And so previously there'd been with second edition had been like the Black Codex army list, and then the Codex had come out. So that we wanted to replicate the idea of the Black Codex. So large part of the book is actually the army lists and the rules, so that and a lot of the design that went into the army lists here carried through to the codexes themselves. It's not often you get a chance with a big game system like 40k or Warhammer to start that. Did it with third edition 40k and the same as with sixth edition Warhammer. But taking a lot of product off the shelves isn't desirable a lot of the time. So one of the main things we got to do was reset the benchmarks and recalibrate the game system in many ways, so that the profiles, the stats of the models were key to their differences within the new rule set. And part of that was actually another part of the brief was positioning Space Marines correctly in the game, as well as these sort of making sure they were these elite troops that felt special, that felt like they were kind of like the core of the game, and that certain aspects of their characteristics were reflected in the game. So, for example, the way that Rick designed the cover system, and the armor save system, are kind of, again, not just for Space Marines, but they highlight the Space Marines. So, for example, because originally cover gave you a 5-up save, which you could take instead of your normal armor save. So that basically meant if you were hit by a powerful weapon, you'd want to be in cover. But actually, against normal small arms fire and stuff, Space Marines just don't mind standing. They bring their cover with them. They've got their power armor, so the rules were designed to represent those kind of things. Another big streamlining was on the vehicles, obviously, again allowing people to field more tanks and stuff, because that was something we were seeing on the tabletops. People wanted to do transports, and over the latter end of second edition, there were a lot more plastic kits coming out, with tanks for the Imperial Guard and the Falcon and Wave Serpent for the Eldar and that kind of thing. So again, vehicles have become a lot more prominent in the game, certainly from Rogue Trader days, but even across most of second edition, which have been dominated with like the Rhino and the variants and the Land Raider, really. But now lots of people had access to it, and it was expected that new factions or the revised factions would have some kind of plastic vehicle as part of the range. So again, vehicles had to become part of a very playable part of the system, as opposed to like an exceptional entire rule system bolted onto the side, which is what they tended to end up being elsewhere in previous editions. And then so part of this as well was the idea that a main part of this was the army list redesign was the force organization charts, which was something that we kind of just, it was almost a visual style when you sort of look at traditional, what's like historical, tables of organization and equipment, and just that visual element to it. And it was also one of the key bits of feedback from another game when we'd moved to Epic 40,000 and the army list system. One of the key concerns or criticisms with existing players have been that the old Space Marine, the old Titan Legion style army cards have disappeared, and again that visual element of I've got a company and these are the sports. So the idea of a graphic representation of your army selection and moving away from just you send a certain percentage of your points on certain models helped shape the way people collected their armies and the way we presented the game and what was a typical army. You couldn't just turn up with a Space Marine army without tactical Space Marines in it. It's like, no, these form the core. In most circumstances, in the standard mission, tactical Space Marines form the core of the fighting group. Actually, scouts were in troops as well, so you could turn up without tactical Space Marines. But the general idea being, you would have orcs in your orc army, and you'd have Imperial Guard platoons in your Imperial Guard army and things, and not just have an army of wacky stuff and a couple of characters. Again, part of that emphasis on having more models on the table or more unit-based action rather than individual miniatures. And so I think in the rulebook itself, we made quite a bit of that. There were various different. We had breakthrough missions, look here, raids, all of that stuff, and we never quite followed through. Is one of the regrets, I think, with this kind of period for 40k is we defaulted to the standard missions and kind of like this kind of standard pick up and play, particularly in the Codex and things, for quite a long time. And we ended up actually tying ourselves a bit in knots around it, because it is quite limiting. It's deliberately limiting in some respects, but actually on an army by army basis, that very standard 2 HQ, 2 to 6 troops and things didn't necessarily work, or rather the army lists, we hadn't quite learned enough about designing the army list into that system to make the most of it. So, for example, it always felt slightly off with something like the Space Marines, for example. They had 2 HQ choices, but they've got so many cool characters. They've got apothecaries and librarians and chaplains and chaptermasters and all that kind of stuff, and they could only ever take 2. And it was like, so obviously in later editions, when the idea of command squads or just manipulating that force organisation in slightly more interesting ways has kind of come about, all detachments and that kind of stuff. So we were a little bit puritanical because we were stripping everything back. It was a good time to rebalance the game. Everything was going back to the main stat blocks and a couple of special rules and things. And obviously that expanded out as we're doing the range of the codexes. And as we wanted to add character back into the armies, and we learned more about how people were playing the game, we're like, oh, okay, here's some cool orky rules, here's mobbing up and that kind of stuff that makes it, and seeing, the system was so new. So although we played loads of the game, there's nothing like unleashing it on the populace to get all the feedback and stuff. And then so when we came to the codexes, we were able to actually understand the implications of some of these new systems a lot better. Yeah, exactly. So the basic work we've done here in the stat lines and weapons worked okay, but it's a case of like it was. We'd pared it back so much, which was good, because then we were starting from a very solid base, and we weren't going in and making stuff, giving it. It was, again, part of that making Space Marine special was about condensing like the strength and toughness stats for things. So being strength 4, being toughness 4 really mattered, because it wasn't like, oh, everybody in their dog gets a strength bonus now or a toughness bonus, and like really big things might go up to toughness 6. And I remember with the Eldar Codex, obviously the big revelation and controversy was me making Wraith Lords toughness 8, which made them, with the way the system worked, essentially made them immune to bolters, strength 4 weapons, which was the idea, because they were a big hardy construct, but they were different to vehicles. And again, that was the vehicles and the vehicle penetration system and getting sort of like glancing hits and stuff, and the way they worked again was nicely balanced for certain types of weapons, but it gave us an opportunity to add character. So there, you could mobilize things, you could take their weapons out, but it was on a general basis rather than having to have like in previous editions you'd have damage charts for every single type of vehicle. The damage charts on an Orc buggy were different to the damage charts and bearing in mind that jet bikes were vehicles originally as well. So the idea of like squads on jet bikes, even or bikes in general, each having their own kind of unique damage properties and stuff like that, and having to roll which bits of it you hit. Stuff. I mean, there's for detailed systems like there's various iterations. I really liked towards the end of Road Trader, just before second edition came out, was the vehicle manual, which I've got a copy of somewhere, which came with a little transparent flexi targeting grid and outlines of all the vehicles, and you say, oh, I'm going to shoot the tyres, and then you'd have a little bit of a scatter on your hit depending on all the rest, which is great if you like firing at one or two things and that's the focus of the game. But if you want to have like 3 or 4 rhinos and a Land Raider and it's just too much. Yeah, absolutely. And trying to keep the playtime under a couple of hours. Fun enough, you saying you're talking to Jervis about the tournaments again. We'd had, without necessarily being influenced by reading about the tournament side of it, but the lots of the pick up and play element, or the time constraints of running tournaments, made us very aware of the limitations of second edition and what and chatting to the players there and what they were wanting to field, and feeling like they wanted to play bigger games, but they're not necessarily having more time, which of course has become true to this day. Time has become more and more the most the rarest commodity we can get off people. So more models to paint and quicker games, basically. Yeah. Just like rebalance the hobby slightly.
Yeah, I remember a series of articles in White Dwarf from around the time of like 40k in 40 minutes.
Yeah.
And it was even a thing for like getting kids at school during the lunchtime to be able to play.
Yes.
People on their lunch break having a 40-minute game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Still 20 minutes to have your lunch.
Yeah, well, that's right. And the what was really good, and the thing we never quite cracked with Warhammer, but what happened particularly with edition 40k, was it scaled really well. So actually, if you had your minimum 1 HQ and 2 troops choices, which might only be like 300-400 points, was still actually an entertaining battle. There's still enough going on, like say for and if you 500 points or whatever was there was certainly enough going on that to be entertaining. But very dynamic as well, because of the way the movement worked, because of the way the rapid fire rules and the ranges worked, and the stuff, the way it scaled, essentially. Stuff was either essentially longer range. Once you get into that 24-inch, which is kind of typical deployment range, it starts to get into sort of like proper firefights and things like that. And then once you're within 6, you're within like assault range and and certainly within sort of rapid fire range or assault weapon range and stuff. So there was a nice sense of things getting as stuff sort of closed in. Yeah, exactly. More stuff happened. So that support weapons felt right and vehicles were sort of like in their place, but actually. It's still, although we were using more models and stuff, it still felt very crunchy in terms of characters could still be quite influential without being over the top and that kind of stuff. And another, again, this happened with Warhammer as well, but again, one of the things that sort of occurred, which wasn't, I don't know if it was a deliberate choice or whatever, but it used to be that lots of games were played on an 8 foot by 4 foot table. That was kind of like a classic big war games table, and we'd do bat reports, and Warhammer was played on that. And actually, around about this time is when we went to a 6 by 4. So again, we condensed the playing area as well, which just made it a bit more practical. So you, again, it's moving towards being more of its own thing rather than just inheriting essentially a lot. The Warhammer system evolved out of a skirmish game, but then sort of more historical, large blocks of troops kind of game. And 40k had always been like an adjunct to that. And then third edition was when it was basically designed in its own right. It kind of went from being sort of a weird kind of ancients battles thing with guns kind of sort of system to being a much more a much
individually defined. Almost.
Yeah, absolutely, and being its thing, and that blend of shooting and melee and things like that working just a bit better, and so that set us up. I mean, we did come back to like the force organisation charts with things like City Fight and Cities of Death and Apocalypse and things, but it's one of those. Just looking back, we could have, particularly because we went through a period of doing lots of variant army lists and things like, especially for like the Index Astartes and the Index Traitor type stuff. And we did some interesting things in there, like, Iron Warriors can have an extra heavy support or whatever. So, but they tended to be on the variants and we didn't do it enough necessarily with just a basic list of like, orcs should have a minimum of 3 troops. I don't know. But there were, that idea of a standard force organisation probably came just to dominate our thinking a bit too much. But then again, we were pretty busy, so standardising the play helped a lot.
But I enjoyed, like, as a player of third edition at the time, like I enjoyed the variant lists kind of thing. It was like an exciting thing to play against or to be able to do kind of thing. I mean, my own personal experience, I never found that the standard list like limiting or anything or boring.
No.
For me, a great game to play, but also having kind of extra articles in White Dwarf with additional rules so that you could pick up and choose to implement if you wanted to do so.
Yes, and it's one of those where we started really getting into that, of sort of in other interviews and things I talked about before, but there's sort of like the area between where rules stop and hobby begins, and it's like the difference between painting these ones red and these ones blue or whatever. But actually, the Codex range, and again, Space Marines in particular, that's where we started branching out. They weren't just like Ultramarines painted red with one troop type. It's like, well, no, the Blood Angels actually have to start having their own special rules. The Dark Angels having their own special rules, for good or bad. It's just like adds character stuff, but it can proliferate and all that kind of stuff. And are they really just most of the time they're just Space Marines? Is it overemphasized certain traits and things? But yeah, it was. But because we'd done that work of the thing about doing the army lists in here, they were all at the same time. So actually, we were getting to play the Space Marines against the Orcs, against the Imperial Guard, against the Eldar, against the Tyranids, against whatever. Dark Eldar, they were new. We'll talk about that. Yeah. So on that basic level, we once you get to codexes, there's always like, well, you don't know what's coming next, so it's hard to plan for what's going to be the next project in terms of like how the rules will end up and stuff. So once you're onto that sort of development treadmill, it's always the next thing, and you're always kind of half looking over your shoulder but trying to look to the front. Whereas actually just designing all the armies, the basics of the armies, and getting the stats down. One of the it was even just like making arbitrary decisions really. So one of the problems with second edition and the way the points calculator system worked was that the baseline would become the Space Marine, which meant that everything was either better than the Space Marine or cheaper than the Space Marine, and Space Marines were just kind of average. And it's like, okay, so one of the things we did is we just decided the Imperial Guardsman would be a base. It's like an Imperial Guardsman, this is a human stat line, Imperial Guardsman, Lasgun, and it's going to be 5 points, arbitrary 5 points. And then that, and work from there. And so Space Marines, Space Marines were like 30 points or 15 points each, I think, or just like they are 3 times better than the Guardsmen, and these are their stat increases. And so again, it just made things like that more relevant, because rather than having a superhuman base level, it's like, no, we've got a human base level, and that again, just the point of weapon skill makes a difference, point of toughness or leadership or whatever it might be.
And it adds a layer of plausibility, I suppose, to like the mindset when you're playing the game. Like you say, if you're using these superhumans as the baseline, and then everyone is equally as good or if not better, it kind of detracts from the immersion, I suppose.
Yes,
Whereas third edition, like you say, you kind of got just a conscript with a las gun.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just, the things that were better than Space Marines were things like big monsters, demons, and even characters. And we, again, with one exception, we sort of, we imposed sort of limits on ourselves. So, to kind of maintain that through the codexes, which is why, the Eldar are strength 3, toughness 3, and they're like the only real exceptions was like the Farseer, who's turned into crystal, gets to be toughness 4. Sure. Whereas previously, again, to be tough, he had to kind of go up to toughness 5, and so just although we were using a very narrow range of stats at that point, and it was making, with everything flattened out, it just made things a bit easier to make stuff exceptional without having to go too far. The classic one being the Bloodthirster was weapon skill 9, so an Avatar of Cain was weapon skill 10. So it's the only thing in the game that has a 3+ against the Bloodthirster, because it's another god of war, but refined rather than beast. Whereas of course the Bloodthirster has loads more attacks and all kinds of other stuff. But those little things, at that level, when you're doing everything together and looking at stuff, you get to do those things as a whole. And make some of those decisions of like, this is the only thing that gets to be this. This is the only thing, this is, like I say, the deliberate choice with the Eldar to go from having, like Guardians used to have las guns, but it's like, no, actually, again, we started, that's like a holdover from when everyone had everything really. Like, Harlequins could, it wasn't really in second edition, but certainly first edition, and some of that of like, Harlequins could have Land Raiders because that's the only plastic kit, that kind of stuff. So actually, Guardians get shuriken weapons, they get these assault weapons, they're about movement, they're about, they fight differently. They're not just guardsmen with pointy ears, they're Eldar Guardians, and they work slightly differently. And there were people like, oh, that you've invalidated models. Like, well, I haven't, because there's no choice. So clearly those models you've got are Guardians, and those las guns are shuriken catapults. They just look different. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like they could be anything else. It's not misleading. So try to sort of maintain that.
Because I suppose at the same time as this all happening, the kind of wider IP of 40k was kind of being refined a bit more as well. So like you say, you mentioned Harlequins being able to access Land Raiders.
Yes.
And obviously nowadays that's kind of completely unthinkable. But back then it was the norm.
No, absolutely. And I think, defining those, going back and defining a lot of those characteristics, and of course, talking about plastic vehicles. But again, this is where we're starting to move into plastic sets. This is the start of the plastic strategy proper, because we're designing armies from scratch. Again, the troop types is about bulk. So again, the plastic strategy is about getting those. It gave us a core to what the range plans could be, because it's like, well, actually, those troop types, we're expecting people to, be the basis of their armies. Therefore, they're the things that need to be in plastic first. Vehicles, obviously, just the size-wise, they need to be in plastic. But actually, it's like your scouts and your tactical Space Marines and Orc boys and Eldar Guardians, and the Eldar have always been difficult, because the kind of Guardians are kind of the core, but actually the core of the army is aspect warriors, and there's loads of them of different types and stuff, so there's always been problematic. But Tyranid warriors and termagants, and lots of these have been in plastic already, but the new style battle, squad sets and battle forces that came out, and the idea of even being able to do army boxes and things that weren't like
the production kind of just will ramp up,
yes,
scale up completely.
And then and again, talking about developing the imagery, I was just thinking about this before, but it's looking through the color section. But one of the things it's a lot of people kind of just take for granted now and don't quite realise, because people go, oh, this is where it's like getting darker again and things like that. And some of it I think helps because the fact that John had done. It'd come up with this Black Templars, and they were the focus for a bit, and they were a lot more gothic and Ultramarines and stuff, and they were the poster boys. But actually, I think one of the main things, there's still quite a few in there, but actually moving away from the dogma of Goblin Green bases, and then the colour schemes just became that little bit more. I wouldn't say realistic, but just a slightly different palette from the red. The red period had kind of gone by this point. But having stuff on desert tables, on ice tables, and not just the flocked green and the Goblin Green bases, brought everything into a different reality for people. I think the line between it being games and models and the photography being a real world started to come across more, because we were able to start showing that variety of stuff.
It's funny. I did a video on Necromunda with Jervis and Rick, and they said the exact same thing. But at the time, when Necromunda first came out, you had all the kind of hive oil rigging looking architecture, and everyone's on a Goblin Green base with Flock at Brian Ansell's kind of insistence, and obviously eventually that kind of quickly went on.
Well, I mean, it's. Where we broke it really was on Epic 40,000. We did the Imperial Fists were our poster boys of Space Marines, and so they had yellow armour and a lot of red on them and stuff, and they looked really good on the sandy bases, and the terrain team wanted to make a cool desert table and stuff. And it was a different, very bespoke look for Epic 40k at the time, and marked it out as different for 40k, and also showed like look, you can make stuff look cool without having Goblin Green bases, basically. And then from there on in, of course, it's not just that, like I said, there was the graphic approach and the general imagery and things, but actually I think just, again, coming to those colour pages, because again, the thing to remember is this is still almost all black and white. This is still on the cusp of digital printing, well, not digital printing, but the reprographics revolution and that kind of stuff. I think by this point, people had Power Max in the design studio and that kind of stuff, but it was still I feel going out to an external repro house, maybe something like that. So production-wise, it wasn't literally paste up, but it wasn't quite modern publishing as we'd understand it now, like straight to print digital or anything like that. And so colour still costs more, but there's also just a nice aesthetic to it, not being full colour in some ways. I mean, I know 40k the design of 40k tends to be still focused and is quite good at making sure that it doesn't get too garish, I suppose, but actually because of the cleanness of the second edition, the content of the second edition Codexes and the Codex Imperialis is great, but actually the visual cleanness of it, and then having a lot of this green in the colour sections and stuff, again, I suppose one of the other things is
I mean, the term grimdark is obviously thrown around a lot
these
days, isn't it? And I suppose third edition, you've already mentioned the Black Templars, John's artwork.
Yeah, and the Dark Eldar again coming out again. They've got a much more subdued palette. Again, so they were of the period. And I suppose people, as they remember what was happening of like the Dark Eldar being introduced. This was we had a little bit. There was the small force of Necrons and things like that were around the corner, that kind of stuff. So this was, in many ways, this is the defining image for people. Stuff like Wayne England, just character pieces, and actually, one of the main things I did, this is one of the first background sections that I was responsible for, which became a bit of a habit. I think third, definitely fourth. I don't think so. Third and fourth editions, basically, I was in charge of the putting together the narrative background sections, basically, and essentially working out how do we tell people about 40k in one place and all the rest of it, and stealing a lot from Rogue Trader, but also a lot from the Codex Imperialis particularly. But again, difference. So rather than these the maps traditionally had been like very full color, lots of bright icons and stuff like that. So again, just doing a monochrome map suddenly makes it feel a little bit with this tattered parchment. And we started, from Gorka Morka onwards, particularly, we started moving over to this much more in-universe kind of background portrayal. And so, and I had a lot of fun with that. There's all kinds of stuff. And it's funny because you just make, a lot of this was just made up on the fly and stuff. This Worlds of the Imperium spread, which was just, it's just a nice way of saying there's lots of different, you could write a paragraph just saying there are agri worlds and feudal worlds and stuff, but this was just a better way of doing it with nice little David Gallagher pictures and stuff. But this idea of like Aestomare and tithe grades and stuff, and I came up with them just purely for this spread, but then it was a document, and then people focus on it, and you see it cropping up elsewhere to this day, of like, a planet, will be named, and then it's Aestomare of like a tithe grade to be included or whatever. And the same with the formatting, again with Gorka Morka, like this kind of slightly standardised formatting of inquisitorial reports and all this kind of stuff. So this kind of set this took some of that stuff, but actually made it 40k, took it into the core of 40k presentation.
Again, it really adds to like a narrative. Like if you want to include that in your hobby, it's a great way of being able to add a bit more rather than just two players playing a game on the tabletop.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's the sort of thing, because as I've mentioned before, like the background should be as interactive as the rest of the hobby. The games, the rules and stuff. You can paint your miniatures how you want. You can convert them. You can make up scenarios or whatever and stuff. So you can tell your own stories, and that's the big joy of it. And so actually, but sort of like the Word of God stuff. It's like what the Imperium is, what the Emperor is. You can't really monkey with that. But actually giving people lots of examples of in-world stuff that they can make up. You can have your own Inquisitor. You can invent your own chapter. And this is you might even want to present the background this way for your invention. Here's some, here's the means to do it. If you want to just write a little story about why your Imperial Guard regiment are fighting your mates orcs. And then that that kind of that proved like invaluable when we got to the codexes, because it was the brief was like short codexes, no bigger than 48 pages, for a couple of reasons, I believe. One was just to keep the price point down, because I just wanted to focus on people buying miniatures. So, but also just like they wanted codexes back on the shelves quick, as something to sell. But also codexes were, the codexes release is always a hook to hang the miniatures release on as well. So again, the pace of the Codex releases then drove the miniatures release schedule, and that was again an incredible turnaround, really, from what went before in terms of delivery and just the productivity of the studio.
The pace of third edition overall, a lot more. A lot more was produced, I suppose, over the course of third edition, a lot quicker.
Yes.
Than anything previous.
Yeah, well, and we were still doing stuff like Inquisitor and Mordheim and whatever else, but actually then you realise we then took on Lord of the Rings and did the Tau and Netcons and over in Warhammer we were completely redoing like we added the ogres, we were doing the Bretonnians and whatever. So actually there was a lot of stuff happening, really exciting stuff across the thing. But those. Probably, like I say, late 90s into the early 2000s. I mean, and then onwards. But that's the
start of it.
The studio becoming this machine, basically, and not in a bad way, but just having to kind of maintain that release cadence of stuff. One, because people want their stuff to play. Two, because we've got this plastic strategy now, and it's like. It's obviously working and needs to just go forward, and so the quicker we could do that, and then of course there's great stuff. The rest, the very much remembered and commented on. There's the other dangerous aliens. There's a thing here. Sorry, I don't know if you can see that. So, which was like the first mention of Kroot, for instance, and so some were, and there was deliberate gags in there because there's like. We knew what Necrons were, but that's labelled unknown, and then everything else has got a name, that kind of stuff. And what is a Claude Fiend of the Denora sector? Who knows? And that's why we have Kroot. It's just that Dave Gallagher picture. So when we were pitching for new species, for new armies later in the Tau, and then the Kroot were one of them, because we were like, Kroot, they look cool. and
But
became
yeah,
a side of this mercenary race sort of
yeah,
thing.
it being able to kind of use that mysticism almost that was there, it's something you kind of just made up on the spot almost, put it in one page of a rule book.
The galaxy has always been bigger than what's been contained in the books. That's
Sure.
the idea, and there's the and Rick's explanation's always been really good. Of like, it's like you've got this dark galaxy and you're just shining spotlights on it in different places, but there's all the vast unexploredness of it. So this hints at what's in between. But yeah, it's not about being thorough. It's the same with the Eldar on there, the Orcs on there and stuff. It's like they're kind of as they were, but slightly different. And then, again, we did quite a lot of this later on in Imperial. Dave Gallagher. He was just a concept machine. Yeah, absolutely. In a different way, he's historical because he was so grounded in historical, very much like the Perry twins and stuff as well. And then kind of like extrapolating from that into 40k in many ways. But he was, when we did the Imperial Guard Codex, third edition Codex, and it just had that spread of like different variants, most of which were just riffs on different like military uniforms and things like that. But all of these different Imperial Guard regiments, and again, inspiration, the idea, it's like, oh, cool, actually, we could make those one of the, or I could take this Mordian and paint him slightly differently, and then he becomes one of these, Mordians in red. But done very quick and loose is essentially the idea. It's like there's a tendency to overdo some of that stuff, and we did it later potentially. Like you get carried away with you want painted miniatures for colour schemes because you're selling the miniatures and all that kind of stuff, and then suddenly you have a spread of different. We did this when we got around to Chaos Space Marines for 4th edition, for instance. We had loads of variants of like of Chaos Space Marine warbands because that was a really important thing. But they're all really full colour, so there were probably half as many as we could have done. Colour schemes was kind of important though because some of them had like weird, like literally flames on their armour, and things like that. But yeah, just being able to kind of convey that background stuff in 48 pages. Those army lists entries couldn't get too complicated. You couldn't have too much war gear. You couldn't have because there just wasn't the space for it. Looking at the new 196 page like Space Marine Codex or whatever, which has got essentially 3 game systems in it between like Crusade and 40k and various other things, and you're like, it is what it is, but it's like that and loads of background as well. Again, like you got 80 pages of that is like probably a background section and talk about Space Marines and all the rest of it, and also just like the sheer number of troop types proliferated and things. And compared to we had to like convey everything about Space Marines to a first timer in 48 pages. But that made us, it's like it hones your thinking. It's like being a journalist or whatever, and it's like, well, you've got 200 words of copy to tell this story. Sure. It's like, well, every paragraph, every word has to count.
Yeah, it has to be important.
And so it kind of breeds a writing efficiency, but also forces you to think more presentationally. It's not just about what the words are saying, but literally what they look like on the page or doing. So doing stuff like the crazy Eldar metaphysical flow diagram that I did, which was like never meant to be particularly decoded, but kind of was enough to show you this weird. And the idea was that it demonstrated that the Eldar weren't like they were factionalized and stuff, but they were still one Eldar in many ways, and that there wasn't this, particularly with the Harlequins, but also outcasts and things. There was a flow, there was an ecology to the Eldar and the Exodites and everything else, and so they were interrelated. They weren't just like these little things that were put. And they still had relationships potentially with each other, even though they didn't like each other, or they preyed on each other, or whatever it might be. This idea that they're still more unified they're not unified, but still existed as a species, I suppose. But they're kind of like to say more like kindreds of a species rather than just like hard and fast factions. In the same way, the Imperium has always been presented. You don't think of the Imperial Guard separate to the Imperium, or it's one of those.
Yeah, it's all from the same pot.
Yeah, absolutely. And then so on, just like how do we get into orcs without having like over edition trying to condense wily orcs, here we go, freebooters into while you've got like 6 pages of background and an army list, and actually there's loads of cool stuff we want to add in, so but again they were another big I wouldn't say contentious, but again through Gorkamorka and into that Orc Codex was again a repositioning, a refocus of what the Orcs were. And while I think again, they've been allowed to spread out a bit and include a bit broader imagery again. The focus was very much on like, this is the barbarian horde at the door. This is, you don't want them to. And so, although they still had some of that comic element to it, a lot of it was played down. It was much more, I say the force of nature that's going to turn up and wreck your planet and enslave you and do nasty things. And I think that's part of, again, plays very much so into that impression that this is when the darkness came back into it a little bit, and it wasn't about goth rockers in slash hats and stuff, which is all, again, it's like, I think, there was a bit of a let's say, I wouldn't say overreaction, but we were very on point about creating these images and stuff, and then they've been allowed to proliferate and grow a bit more, but that you had to prune back, I think. Everything could be literally made up as it was going along with Brian's guidance and whatever else, and whatever came into Rick's head or John's head or Brian's head, and then that would be added in or whatever. So whereas this was an opportunity to be more measured about it, it's like, well, actually, out of the grab bag, this is the things to focus on. That's all a bit weird. It doesn't not exist. We're just not going to really pay attention to that bit anymore, and build that discipline of designing the look of armies, the feel of armies, the range of an army, as projects, as, like I say, it's now the turbo design machine that it is these days, churning out like 5 games a week or whatever. This is what enabled it, was that run up from a clean slate rather than that continued hand to mouth. I think of not in a bad way, but just like pure. Again, second edition. Again, Rick had established the codexes, the army books for Warhammer, to give you that sort of cycle. That then those releases and drops that moved away from the pure chaos and anarchy of the first period, the golden years, as it were, of just like, oh well, whatever. Brian's asked somebody to design these, we need to make some rules for them, or it's like, actually we've just come up with more Space Marines or whatever. This is now. It's where it was always been about the miniatures, but I think in terms of the range planning and stuff like that and stuff, is where the miniatures then really started to, because of the plastics plan, because plastics rules everything, and they're so long. Once you've cut steel, that's done. Then this is going to be around for 5, 10, 15 years, more even. And actually, yes, some of the kits are still going. Which is crazy, really. But that's kind of the point of it. But that requires a discipline then of and a process that makes sure that that's right, because there's a lot of expense going into that. Not to think, oh, actually, 2 years down the line we did that wrong, and that's not the right. It's like we're starting to regret that. It was, I think, as a line in the sand that sort of like demarcated a new type of 40k. It was really important. It's funny, when I think of my Eldar army, although I played it for quite a long time, my Eldar army really was a 3rd edition 40k army onwards sort of thing. Although I'd loved Eldar since White Wolf 127 and things again. I got to write the Codex, but it's not just because of that, but it was like literally the models I've got now, half of them are still from this era, whereas I don't really have many from older. So it was like, on a personal level, it's like if I was to go back and play 3rd edition, it's like, well, I've actually got most of the 3rd edition army without changing anything at all. And it was the army I took to various tournaments and events around the world and things like that. I remember I had 2 copies of the Eldar Codex because I'd been to an event in Canada, and there was a prize draw, and one of the prizes was playing me, the new Eldar Codex, but I didn't actually have one. And so I had to buy one for like $15 at a local store for this, or something like that. So was it Canada? Actually, no, it might have been Chicago. But yeah, so I had one which for ages just had this the game store price tag on the back, as well as the one I had, which was funny. So yeah, I mean, a lot of time I played a lot of 3rd edition and 4th edition 40k, just in, not just work wise, but as a hobbyist, yeah, and that was, from a purely self-centered viewpoint, it's like that was the peak of, not necessarily my work, but again, this this is synonymous with that era of when I was, I think happiest at Games Workshop, and what we would, not what we were doing was right, but yeah, it was just, it was short. It was the experience on this and those codexes that I then moved over and took over as Warhammer Lore Master and took that into Warhammer, and through if I hadn't been involved in this, then 6th edition might have been very different. Again, just in terms of we had a bit more space in 6th edition Warhammer and all the rest of it. So everyone was learning lessons, but actually this was and into Inquisitor obviously, but this was my education of how game systems are created and run, really, as opposed to, which is odd because I joined Games Workshop just after 2nd edition was launched. So, my first job was pasting up mock-up cards for War Gear and Psychic Powers on a deck of playing cards that Andy Chambers had printed out. It's like, here's the spray mount, stick those on there. So, it was that, Dark, that was the playtest copy of Dark Millennium. So, I grew up sort of like on 2nd edition, but I hadn't really played much 2nd edition. Like I say, I was mostly an Epic player before I joined, so I played some 2nd edition, and obviously my first Codex was Sisters of Battle for 2nd edition stuff. But as a games developer, I wasn't really that involved, particularly with the development of 40k. We did quite a bit, obviously, through White Dwarf, and there were a few bits of characters and obviously the battle reports and stuff like that. But actually, after I went back from White Dwarf to games dev, it was Sisters of Battle. There was like digging up Gorkamorka sort of thing. But then it was this was the big project, and then from there, being basically part of the 40k team. It was me, Andy, Jervis, and then we're the 40k team for a long while. Up until then, I took over from Thomas Pirinen in Warhammer. So yeah, it was very, very important, I think, that just era defining, they say, for the next 15 years probably, I would say. Certainly past when I left, and I think there's as we were saying earlier, there's still a lot here that still informs core 40k, and actually and with things like the Horus Heresy 28mm game, 13mm game, whatever version of this, it goes back to some of the basic simplicity, some of the simplicities that we had in here, I think, because it's about large units of troops fighting each other with a few special rules, kind of stuff, that kind of thing. It's one of those I could happily just go back and play it. I think there's a reason it's this, and 4th edition was just a tidy up, really. So and again, the codexes don't change, so they all seem like the same game, really. You can pick up and play this quite easily. I say particularly because I've got the Elder Army built for it. Hardly changed it since.
That's 3rd edition.
That was 3rd edition 40k.